Everyone, there's something we've been waiting to tell you. I'm going to marry Grace.
No, Ryan, you can't marry her. No. Is everything okay? Parent? Oh my God.
From the day I met you,
I knew you were home. Whenever you're ready. Just give me one more minute.
what do you mean I can't marry her? I never had a sister.
Barely said a word all evening.
I think I know who Grace really is. The records were sealed.
Then how could anyone know?
I don't remember this. No, that's impossible.
From the moment they
I have
met,
to know the truth.
it felt like they had known each other their whole lives. Ryan Coleman would later say he felt it before Grace Hensley even said a word. Standing across a crowded room in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Friday evening in early spring, watching a woman in a blue coat walk in and feeling something in his chest simply stop. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know where she was from. He knew only that he had been waiting for this exact moment his entire life, and that the feeling made no logical sense at all. The room that night belonged to a mutual friend's housewarming, one of those gatherings where half the guests know each other from college and the other half are plus ones nobody quite remembers inviting. Ryan had almost skipped it. He'd worked a 10-hour shift at the engineering firm, where he'd been a project manager for 6 years, and the idea of small talk over lukewarm beer held little appeal. He came anyway, because his coworker Dave had promised there would be good food, and because staying home alone on a Friday had started to feel less like peace and more like avoidance. Grace almost didn't come either. She had a deadline the following Monday for a client presentation. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown, and part of her wanted to stay in with a glass of wine and her laptop. But her roommate, Aaron, had dragged her out, insisting she'd been working too much and needed, in Aaron's words, to remember she was a person and not a spreadsheet. Grace walked in, wearing a blue coat she'd bought on a whim 2 winters earlier, and had never quite found the occasion to wear until that night. She would later laugh, in the early months of their relationship, about how close she'd come to leaving it on the hook by her apartment door. Neither of them could explain, later, exactly what happened in the seconds that followed. Ryan would describe it as a kind of stillness, as though the room had quietly muted itself around her. Grace would describe it not as attraction, but as recognition, the way your body remembers a childhood home before your mind does. Neither of them questioned it that night. Neither of them had any reason to. They had no idea how right that feeling was, or how devastatingly wrong. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always love hearing that. And if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because stories like this one don't come around often, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Ryan crossed the room first. He would later admit he had no real plan, no opening line prepared, just an unfamiliar certainty pulling him toward her the way gravity pulls without asking permission. He introduced himself by nearly knocking over a drink on the counter beside her, which made her laugh before he'd even said a full sentence. They talked for the rest of the night, oblivious to the party continuing around them, discovering within an hour that they'd both grown up loving the same obscure 80s movie, that they both hated cilantro with an intensity that seemed almost personal, that they both, as children, had been mildly and inexplicably afraid of the dark shape of ceiling fans at night. Small things, things that felt, at the time, like proof of something larger. Within weeks, Ryan and Grace were inseparable, and within months, their families had started to notice something almost unsettling about how quickly and completely they had fallen for each other. Friends described 2 adults in their early 30s behaving like teenagers discovering love for the first time, finishing each other's sentences, drawn without explanation to the same strange, specific things, laughing before either of them had even finished a joke. Aaron would later tell a counselor that watching them together sometimes felt like watching 2 people speaking a private language neither of them had consciously learned. Nobody around them thought to ask the obvious question, the one that would come crashing down on both of their lives within the year. Somewhere in their past, long before that night in Charlotte, a decision had been made that neither of them knew anything about, a decision that would eventually explain exactly why their connection felt less like falling in love and more like coming home to something they had lost a long time ago. To understand what happened at that dinner table in October, you have to go back 3 decades, to a small rented house on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina, where Ryan Coleman's story actually begins. Diane and Frank Coleman had married young. Diane was barely 21, Frank 23, the kind of early marriage that families sometimes worry about and sometimes quietly admire, depending on how it turns out. They'd met at a community college night class, neither of them finished, both working full days and studying at night, drawn to each other by a shared exhaustion and a shared stubbornness about building something better than what either of them had grown up with. Ryan arrived when Diane was 22. She would tell him, in later years, that the day he was born was the first time she understood what it meant to be terrified and complete at the same moment. Frank worked construction, picking up whatever jobs he could find through a rotating cast of subcontractors, and money was tight in the particular way that doesn't announce itself all at once, but instead shows up in small refusals. The winter coat that doesn't get replaced, the car repair that gets postponed, the dinner that stretches one more night than it should. Diane would later describe those first 2 years as some of the hardest and happiest of her life, the two of them building something out of almost nothing, certain that things would eventually get easier. For a while they did. Frank found steadier work with a contractor who liked his reliability. Diane took a part-time job at an elementary school, answering phones and filing records, work that felt almost luxurious in its predictability. By the time Ryan turned 2, the Colemans had started to believe they had made it through the worst of their struggles as a young family. Diane bought a second-hand crib for the nursery she hoped, quietly, they might someday need again. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, Frank fell 11 feet from a scaffold that hadn't been secured properly. He broke his pelvis and 2 vertebrae. He would recover, eventually, but not for the better part of a year, and the steady work disappeared along with his ability to do it. There was no workers' compensation claim that covered enough. There was a lawsuit that dragged on for years and settled for far less than the family needed. Diane discovered she was pregnant again only weeks after the accident, at a moment when the family had almost nothing left to fall back on. She has said, in the only interview she ever agreed to give many years later, that she remembers sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the test in her hand, doing math in her head that refused to add up no matter how she rearranged it. She and Frank spent the following months facing decisions no young parents should have to face, choosing between rent and groceries, borrowing from relatives who had little to spare themselves, watching the small stability they had built for Ryan begin to slip through their fingers one bill at a time. Diane took on a second part-time job cleaning offices at night. Frank, still in a back brace, tried twice to return to light work and was sent home both times by a doctor who told him, not unkindly, that his body wasn't ready and might never fully be the same. When their second child was born, a daughter, Diane held her for 6 hours in a hospital room in Asheville before she and Frank made the decision that would define the rest of both of their lives. The maternity ward at Mission Hospital in Asheville was quiet that afternoon. Diane has described the light in the room many times since, a flat, indifferent October light coming through the blinds, the kind that makes no distinction between the best days of your life and the worst. She had already decided, before the birth, that she and Frank would place the baby for adoption. A caseworker from a private agency, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Vance, had met with them twice in the preceding weeks, walking them through the process with a gentleness that Diane would later say she was grateful for and resentful of in equal measure. Grateful because it made an impossible decision feel survivable. Resentful because some part of her had wanted someone to talk her out of it. Frank had agreed to the plan with the flat, exhausted resignation of a man who had run out of other ideas. He would say, decades later, that he spent those 9 months doing the arithmetic of survival. Rent, formula, doctor's visits for Ryan, doctor's visits for the injury that wouldn't heal, and that every version of that arithmetic came out the same way. He has also said that agreeing to it and living with it turned out to be two entirely different things. Diane asked to hold her daughter before the paperwork was signed. The hospital, to its credit, allowed her more time than some agencies
Whenever
of
you're
that era
ready.
permitted. 6 hours, uninterrupted except
me
for a
one more
nurse
minute.
checking in twice. Diane spent those hours doing what new mothers do instinctively, counting fingers, memorizing the particular shape of a small nose, noticing a pale, crescent-shaped birthmark just above the baby's left collarbone, faint as a pencil mark, the kind of detail that means nothing to anyone else in the room and everything to the person who will spend 30 years trying not to think about it. She did not choose a name that would be recorded anywhere permanent. She has said she chose one privately, in her own mind, and never told anyone what it was, not even Frank, because she was afraid that giving the decision a name would make it impossible to go through with. When Patricia Vance returned with the paperwork, Diane signed it without reading most of it, because reading it felt like it would take longer than she could bear. Frank signed after her, his hand unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. The baby was placed with an adoption agency that, at the time, matched infants with waiting families through a closed record process, meaning that once finalized, neither the birth parents nor the adoptive family would have legal access to each other's identifying information. A system designed, in that era, to protect the privacy of everyone involved, though it would later prove to protect no one from the questions that time tends to generate anyway. Diane never spoke about that daughter to anyone outside her marriage, not for years, not to her own mother, not to her sister, not to the friends who noticed she seemed different after that autumn and assumed it was simply the strain of Frank's recovery. She carried the memory quietly, the way people carry losses they are not permitted to grieve openly, folding it into the back of her mind every time she looked at Ryan, who grew up as an only child, unaware that he had ever had a sister at all. Frank and Diane's circumstances did improve eventually. Frank returned to work 18 months later, slower and more careful but capable. Diane's job at the school became full-time. By the time Ryan was 5, the family owned a small house instead of renting one. And in later years, in private, painful conversations that happened only after Ryan was asleep, Diane and Frank sometimes wondered aloud whether they could have kept her if they had simply waited 2 more years. But by then, the adoption was long finalized, the records sealed under the privacy laws of the time, and Diane told herself, the way many birth parents do, that the not knowing was a wound she would simply have to carry for the rest of her life, quietly, the way she carried everything. 2 hours away, in Columbia, South Carolina, that same daughter was growing up as Grace Hensley, the third of 4 children in a large, loud, loving household headed by Carol and Michael Hensley. Carol had struggled for years with infertility before the Hensleys began building their family through adoption. Their oldest son, Marcus, had come to them as a toddler through the foster system. Their second child, a daughter named Julia, was a biological surprise that arrived 2 years after Marcus, against every medical prediction the Hensleys had been given. Grace came next, adopted as an infant through the same agency that had processed the Coleman baby's placement. A fourth child, a son named Theo, joined the family through adoption 3 years after Grace. Unlike many adoptees of that era, Grace's adoption had never been a secret. Carol and Michael were open about it from the very beginning, celebrating what they called Gotcha Day every year with a small family dinner, treating her story as something to be proud of rather than something to hide or soften. Michael liked to say that the Hensley family had been built the way a good stew is built. A little of this, a little of that, all of it simmering into something better than any single ingredient could have made alone. It was a corny line. He said it every year anyway, and every year the kids groaned and then quietly loved it. Grace grew up secure in that openness, surrounded by siblings who felt entirely, uncomplicatedly like family, regardless of how any of them had arrived in the household. But she also grew up with a set of missing facts about where she began, a quiet gap in her history that no amount of celebration could fully close. She would sometimes catch herself, at school, filling out a family medical history form and staring at blank fields she had no way to answer. She rarely spoke about it out loud, not because she was ashamed of the curiosity, but because it never seemed urgent enough to chase. It simply sat with her, the way an unopened letter sits on a desk for years, present but untouched, easy to walk past on any given morning. Julia, her closest sibling growing up, would later say that Grace had a habit, even as a teenager, of going quiet during certain conversations. Anytime a friend complained about looking too much like their mother, anytime a movie plot turned on a family resemblance, anytime a teacher asked the class to bring in baby photos for a project. Nothing dramatic, just a small recalibration, a moment where Grace seemed to remember something the rest of the room had forgotten to ask about. Grace studied communications in college, discovered she had a talent for the kind of writing that makes people care about things they hadn't previously thought about, and built a career in marketing that took her, eventually, to Charlotte, where she rented an apartment with a woman named Erin she'd met through a mutual friend, and where, on an ordinary Friday evening in early spring, she would put on a blue coat she almost left on the hook by the door. Before Charlotte, there had been other relationships for both of them. The ordinary accumulation of almosts that precede the one that finally holds. Ryan had dated a woman named Kayla for nearly 3 years in his late 20s, a relationship that ended not in a dramatic rupture, but in the slow, mutual recognition that they wanted different versions of a future. Kayla wanted to move to the coast. Ryan, without quite being able to explain why, felt anchored to the Carolinas in a way he couldn't articulate even to himself. His mother, Diane, had liked Kayla well enough, but friends would later say that Diane's warmth toward Ryan's girlfriends over the years had always carried a faint, careful distance, the distance of a woman guarding something she couldn't name even to herself. Grace had been engaged once before, briefly, in her mid-20s, to a man named Dominic she'd met in her first job out of college. It ended 8 months before the wedding, when Grace admitted to herself, and eventually to him, that she had said yes, out of momentum rather than certainty. Her mother, Carol, had held her through that breakup without a single word of judgment, the same way she'd held Grace through every uncertain season of her life, and had told her, more than once, that she would know the real thing when it arrived, because it would feel less like a decision and more like a fact. Both Ryan and Grace, in their own separate lives, had taken an at-home DNA test at some point in their late 20s. Ryan out of the same mild curiosity that drives millions of Americans to spit into a plastic tube every year, largely as a novelty, a birthday gift from a cousin who thought the results might be fun to compare. Grace had taken hers with more intention, hoping it might fill in a few of the blank fields on those medical history forms she'd never been able to complete, though even then she hadn't pursued it with any real urgency. Both uploaded their results to the same popular genealogy database. Both were largely absorbed, in the months that followed, by the ordinary business of building an adult life. Work, friendships, apartment leases, the small daily maintenance of being a person in your late 20s, and neither checked their account activity closely enough to notice that a new, closely matching relative had quietly appeared in their results months before they ever laid eyes on each other in person. It remains one of the almost unbearable details of their story that the truth had already surfaced in a database, waiting to be noticed, long before either of them exchanged a single word in that crowded Charlotte apartment. What followed their meeting felt, to everyone around them, less like a normal courtship and more like a current neither of them could swim against, and didn't particularly want to. Ryan introduced Grace to his mother within 3 months, far sooner than he'd introduced anyone before. Diane liked her immediately. She would say later that there was something in Grace's laugh that felt oddly, uncannily familiar, though she assumed at the time it was simply the easy familiarity of a woman who made everyone feel at home. Diane told her sister on the phone that night that she had never seen her son this at ease around another person, and she meant it as unqualified good news. What Diane did not say out loud, not that day, was a small detail that had caught her eye the very first time Grace wore a sundress to a family dinner in early summer, a pale, crescent-shaped mark just above her left collarbone. Diane had seen a mark exactly like it once before, 30 years earlier, on an infant she had held for 6 hours in a hospital room before signing paperwork she had spent 3 decades trying not to think about. She said nothing that evening. She told herself, as she cleared the dishes and made pleasant conversation about Grace's job, that it was nothing, a common enough kind of birthmark, the kind that surely thousands of people carried, without any of it meaning anything at all. But the thought did not leave her. It sat in the back of her mind through the rest of dinner, through the drive home with Frank asking why she was so quiet, through the following week at the school office, where she found herself staring at nothing in the middle of filing student records. It resurfaced every time she pictured Grace's face across that table. Not obsessively, not constantly, but persistently, the way a splinter makes itself known only when you press a particular spot. Meanwhile, Grace was falling in love with a completeness that surprised even her. She told Julia over a phone call in early summer that being with Ryan felt less like meeting someone new and more like being handed back a piece of herself she hadn't realized was missing. Julia would later say that something in Grace's voice during that call had struck her as strange, though she couldn't, at the time, have said why. By midsummer, Ryan and Grace were spending nearly every weekend together, alternating between Asheville and Columbia, introducing each other to the small rituals of their separate childhoods. Grace learned that Ryan still hated cilantro and ceiling fans in the dark, tiny details that had first made her laugh in that crowded apartment, and that now felt, in the accumulating weight of the relationship, less like coincidence and more like proof they'd been meant to find each other. For nearly a month after that summer dinner, Diane told no one what she suspected. Not her sister, not her closest friend, not even Frank. She has said, in the years since, that the silence during that month was the hardest thing she has ever done. Harder even than the 6 hours in the hospital room 3 decades earlier. Because at least then she had known, with terrible clarity, what she was facing. This time she had only a suspicion, and the not knowing felt like standing at the edge of 2 entirely different futures with no way to tell which one was real. She began, quietly and carefully, contacting the old adoption agency that had handled her daughter's placement decades earlier. The agency itself had closed more than 15 years prior, its records transferred, as was standard practice, to an archive office in Raleigh that handled sealed adoption files for defunct agencies across the Carolinas. Diane's first call was answered by a records clerk who explained, patiently but firmly, that sealed adoption records from that era could not simply be released on request, regardless of who was asking or why. Diane gave her own name, her own case number, information she had memorized decades earlier without ever intending to use it, the kind of detail a person tells themselves they're keeping just in case, without admitting what the case might actually be. She asked what it would take to request confirmation of a match, and was told, over the course of several increasingly frustrating phone calls, that a limited legal path existed for a birth parent to request confirmation of identity when there was already a strong, independent reason to believe a match had occurred. DNA evidence, most commonly. It was in trying to satisfy that requirement that Diane finally opened the DNA database account she had largely ignored since taking the test years earlier, prompted by nothing more than a passing curiosity about her own ancestry. Buried in an unopened notification, one of dozens of automated emails she had long since stopped reading. A close family match had been sitting untouched for months, a match she had never thought to check because she had never imagined she would need to. When she finally opened it, alone at her kitchen table late one night while Frank slept upstairs, the number on the screen was not a coincidence, and it was not ambiguous. The shared percentage of DNA, the algorithm's own confident label, parent/child relationship, left no room for the kind of doubt she had been quietly hoping to find. Grace was her daughter. Diane sat with that knowledge alone for several days, unable to eat properly, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a stretch, trying to find language for something that had no gentle version. She thought about calling Carol Hensley, the woman who had raised her daughter with more love and openness than Diane had ever dared hope for on that terrible October afternoon 3 decades earlier, but she could not find the words, and she was terrified of what confirming the truth out loud might set in motion, not just for herself, but for everyone at once, all the people who had built entire lives on the assumption of an ordinary story. Diane was still searching for a way forward, still rehearsing sentences in an empty kitchen, still finding every version of them inadequate, when Ryan called her with news of his own. He and Grace were engaged. He'd proposed on a Saturday afternoon in late September, at the overlook near the Blue Ridge Parkway where he and Grace had gone on one of their earliest dates, a spot with a view that Ryan had once joked felt like standing at the edge of the whole world. He'd planned it for weeks, the ring, the timing, even a small speaker tucked in his jacket pocket for a song that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, their song. Grace would say later that she knew what was happening before he got down on one knee, and that she'd already started crying before he finished his first sentence. He wanted to tell his mother in person, not over the phone, and he wanted to do it the right way, with both families together at the same table for the first time, the Colemans and the Hensleys, celebrating not just an engagement, but the merging of two families who, as far as either of them knew, had never had any reason to cross paths before. He asked if Diane would host at the house in Asheville the following weekend. Diane agreed, because she could not find a reason to refuse that would not force the truth out over the phone before she was ready, and because some small, desperate part of her still hoped, against the algorithm, against the birthmark, against everything she had already confirmed, that she had somehow gotten it wrong. She had not gotten it wrong. She knew this even as she said yes. She said yes anyway, because saying no felt like a confession she wasn't prepared to make over the phone, to her son, on what should have been the happiest news of his adult life. Frank had known about their daughter from the very beginning, of course. He had signed the same paperwork, carried the same weight for 30 years in his own quieter way. But he had never known that Diane's private suspicion, the one she'd carried alone since that summer dinner, had hardened into documented, undeniable certainty. He learned the truth from his wife, only 2 nights before the family dinner, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd first opened that DNA match alone, weeks earlier. Diane has described that conversation as one of the few times in their marriage she genuinely didn't know how Frank would respond. He sat perfectly still while she spoke, working through the birthmark, the database notification, the archive office in Raleigh, the confirmation she'd finally received 2 days earlier in a follow-up call that used clinical, official language to describe the single most devastating fact of both their lives. When she finished, Frank didn't speak for nearly a full minute. He spent those 2 nights before the dinner in a silence of his own, not angry, Diane would later clarify, but stunned in the particular way that makes a person go quiet, rather than loud, turning the same handful of facts over and over, looking for an angle that made them easier to hold. He barely slept either night. On the second night, close to 2 in the morning, he finally asked Diane the question that had apparently been circling him the whole time. How, exactly, was she planning to tell their son that the woman he was about to marry was his sister, at a dinner, at their own table, in front of everyone? Diane didn't have an answer. She still didn't have one the following evening, as she set the table for 8. The dinner took place on a Saturday evening in October, almost exactly 30 years, to the season, after Diane had held her daughter for 6 hours in a hospital room 2 hours south. The table was set for 8. Good china that came out only a handful of times a year, a center handpiece of dried hydrangeas Diane had arranged that morning, with hands that would not quite stop shaking. The Colemans sat on one side. The Hensleys sat on the other. Ryan and Grace were seated together at the center of the table, glowing with the particular unguarded happiness of 2 people who believe the hardest part of their story is already behind them. The evening began warmly, full of the easy conversation of 2 families who genuinely liked each other on sight. Carol Hensley laughing at something Frank said about his early, disastrous attempts at cooking for Diane when they were newly married. Michael Hensley pouring wine for the table and telling a long, good-natured story about Grace's childhood stubbornness that made everyone but Diane laugh freely. Diane said very little through most of the meal. She watched her daughter across the table, a woman she had waited 30 years to see again, sitting beside the son she had raised, both of them completely unaware of the connection between them. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever happened next would change the way every person at that table understood their own family, permanently, for the rest of their lives. Dessert had just been served, a pie Carol had insisted on bringing, in the same tradition of contribution the Hensleys brought to every family gathering, when Ryan stood up, took Grace's hand, and told the table he wanted to say something. He said that he had never been surer of anything in his life, that from the very first night he met Grace, something in him had recognized something in her, some feeling he still couldn't fully explain, and that he could not imagine building a future with anyone else. He said, simply, that this was the woman he wanted to marry, and that he was grateful beyond words that both of their families were sitting together at the same table to hear him say it. For a moment, the room was full of warmth, congratulations already forming on the lips of everyone present. Michael Hensley had half risen from his chair to embrace his future son-in-law. Julia had already begun reaching for her phone to take a picture. It was Diane who spoke first, her voice cutting through the room before anyone else could react, steady but breaking at the edges, telling her son that he could not marry Grace. The stillness that followed lasted long enough that several people at that table would later struggle to describe how much time had actually passed. Forks lowered, breath held. Michael Hensley froze half-standing, unsure whether to sit back down or keep moving toward a hug that suddenly seemed impossible to complete. Ryan, stunned, asked his mother what she meant, why she would say something like that, at a moment like this, in front of everyone he loved. His voice carried the particular sharpness of someone who has been blindsided and is still deciding whether to be hurt or angry. Diane looked at her son and then at the young woman beside him and asked him, gently, if he had ever wondered what happened to the sister he never met. Ryan said he didn't understand. He had never had a sister. He said this the way people say obvious, foundational things, not as a question, but as a fact he had never once had reason to doubt. Diane told him then, in the only way she had left, that Grace was his sister, that she and Frank had placed a daughter for adoption 2 years after Ryan was born, during the hardest year of their marriage, through an agency in Asheville that had long since closed, and that the daughter, as far as Diane had now confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt, had grown up as Grace Hensley. The silence that followed the second explanation was different from the first, deeper, more total, the kind of silence that seems to physically press down on a room. Grace turned first to her own mother, searching Carol's face for the denial she was certain would come, certain that this had to be some horrible misunderstanding that the adults in the room would clear up within moments. She found instead a stillness in Carol's expression that told her everything before a single word was spoken, a recognition, not of the specific claim, but of its plausibility, the particular stillness of a parent doing rapid, unwanted math about a closed adoption 30 years in the past. Ryan asked his mother to repeat what she had said, certain he had misheard her, certain that the words couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean. Diane explained everything then, in a voice that had finally stopped shaking, because there was nothing left to protect by shaking. The birthmark she'd noticed that summer evening, the DNA match sitting unopened in a database for months, the archived adoption file in Raleigh, the weeks she'd spent alone trying to find a way to say something that had no gentle version, the 2 sleepless nights Frank had spent beside her, hoping until the very last possible moment that she had somehow, impossibly, been wrong. Nobody remembers precisely how the dinner ended, whether anyone finished the pie, whether goodbyes were said in any conventional sense. What people remember instead are fragments. Grace remembers standing up so quickly, her chair nearly tipped backward, and Ryan's hand, which she had been holding a moment earlier in celebration, suddenly feeling like something she couldn't process touching at all. She remembers Carol following her out to the porch, not to argue, not to explain, but simply to stand beside her while she tried to breathe. Ryan remembers walking out into the front yard alone, standing under the same dark October sky that had witnessed his birth, and decades earlier, his sister's, and feeling an anger toward his mother that he would later come to understand was really directed at nothing, at circumstance, at 30 years of silence he'd had no part in creating, at a fact so large it had nowhere honest to land except on the nearest available person. Frank remembers sitting alone at the table for a long time, after everyone else had scattered into separate corners of the house and yard, staring at the pie no one had finished, thinking, he would later say, about a hospital room he hadn't set foot in for 30 years, but had never really left. Michael Hensley remembers pulling Diane aside, not with anger, but with a kind of stunned gentleness, and asking her, simply, how long she had known. Diane told him the truth, a month, roughly, though the certainty had only solidified in the final days. Michael nodded slowly and said something Diane would repeat to herself often in the months that followed, that he didn't blame her for the 30 years of silence, because none of them had asked for any of this, but that he wished, More than anything, she had found a way to tell them before that particular night, before Ryan had stood up in front of everyone, with a ring already on his fiancée's finger. Neither family drove home that night in the configuration they had arrived in. Ryan stayed, alone, in his childhood bedroom for the first time in over a decade. Grace went home with her parents to Columbia in a car that stayed almost entirely silent for 2 hours. In the days that followed, Ryan and Grace spoke only sparingly, mostly through short, careful texts that neither of them knew how to write. There was no roadmap for this. Every self-help book, every relationship column, every piece of accumulated cultural wisdom about breakups assumed some ordinary rupture. Infidelity, incompatibility, the slow drift of two people growing apart. Neither of them had a category, yet, for what this actually was. The engagement dissolved within 2 weeks, not through anger, but through a slow, disorienting grief that neither of them had language for. Grace returned the ring to Ryan in person, at a coffee shop roughly equidistant between Charlotte and Columbia, a meeting that lasted less than 20 minutes, and that both of them would later describe as one of the hardest conversations of their lives. Harder, Grace said, than any actual breakup she'd been through, because there was no anger available to make it simpler, only an enormous, shapeless loss. They were not simply former partners. They were siblings who had spent a year loving each other the way partners do, and untangling that required something closer to mourning than any ordinary breakup, a grief for a version of the future that had never actually been possible in the first place, and a second, quieter grief for the fact that the connection they'd felt hadn't been imaginary at all. It had simply meant something entirely different than either of them had understood. Both sought counseling, separately at first. Ryan found a therapist through his employer's assistance program who, by coincidence, had some prior experience with adoption-related family cases, though nothing quite like this. Grace found a counselor through a referral from her own primary doctor, a woman named Dr. Patel who specialized in family and identity issues among adoptees. It was Dr. Patel who first explained to Grace, clearly and without judgment, a concept neither Ryan nor Grace nor even Diane had fully understood on their own, that their attraction had a documented explanation, a response sometimes referred to in clinical and research literature as genetic sexual attraction, an intense, often overwhelming pull reported between close biological relatives who are reunited as adults after being separated during infancy or early childhood. Dr. Patel explained that the phenomenon is rooted in the absence of the ordinary, sustained childhood proximity that typically produces something researchers call the birthmark effect, the natural aversion that develops between people raised together from early life, which under normal circumstances makes sibling attraction essentially unthinkable. Without that early bonding, she explained, the brain has no built-in signal telling it this person is family, not a potential partner. And worse, biological relatives often share enough physical, behavioral, and even scent-based similarity that reunited siblings sometimes experience an intense, almost magnetic sense of familiarity that gets misread, understandably, as romantic destiny. It did not make what Ryan and Grace had felt any less real. Dr. Patel was careful, in every session, to make that distinction clear to Grace, and Ryan's own therapist made the same point to him separately. The feeling had been genuine. The joy had been genuine. What had been wrong was only the interpretation, the story their minds had built around a recognition that had a far older, far different source than either of them had guessed. The dinner in October did not only reshape Ryan and Grace's lives, it moved through both families like a slow aftershock, reordering old certainties in ways that took months, in some cases years, to settle. Diane and Frank's marriage, already tested once by hardship 30 years earlier, was tested again in an entirely different way. Frank found himself, in the weeks after the dinner, oscillating between fierce protectiveness of Diane, furious at anyone, including himself, who suggested she should have found a way to tell the truth sooner, and a private, unspoken grief of his own that he struggled to name even in counseling sessions the couple began attending together for the first time in their marriage. He had signed the same papers Diane signed, 30 years earlier. He had carried the same absence, quietly, in his own way, for just as long. And now, like Diane, He had to sit with the fact that the daughter he'd once let go had grown up close enough, geographically and emotionally, to nearly become part of the family again through the one door nobody could have anticipated. Carol and Michael Hensley faced a different kind of reckoning. They had always been proud of their openness about Grace's adoption, had always believed, correctly, that honesty had served their daughter well. But the dinner forced them to confront a harder truth, that openness about the fact of an adoption is not the same as access to its full history, and that even the most loving, most honest adoptive family can only tell the story they themselves were given, which is sometimes a story with pieces missing that nobody, including the agency, thought to preserve. Julia, Grace's closest sibling, took on an unofficial role in the months that followed as something close to a mediator, not between the two families, who mostly kept a respectful, careful distance from each other in the immediate aftermath, but between Grace's private grief and the rest of the Hensley household, who wanted desperately to help and mostly didn't know how. Julia would later say that the hardest part of watching her sister go through that year wasn't the initial shock of the dinner itself, but the long months afterward when Grace had to relearn, slowly, how to think about a year of her life that she couldn't simply erase or pretend hadn't mattered. The path from what Ryan and Grace had been to what they eventually became was neither quick nor linear. There were months, in the year following the dinner, when they didn't speak at all, not out of anger, but because neither of them knew what a conversation between them was supposed to sound like anymore. The easy rhythm they'd once had, the finished sentences and shared jokes, had belonged to a relationship that no longer existed, and neither of them wanted to force something new into its shape before either of them was ready. The first real conversation between them as siblings happened almost by accident, nearly 8 months after the dinner, when Diane's birthday brought both families into loose, cautious proximity for the first time since October. Ryan and Grace ended up alone in Diane's kitchen for a few minutes, both reaching for the same stack of plates, and something in the ordinary domestic collision broke the ice in a way neither of them had managed to plan. They talked, haltingly at first, about nothing important, Grace's new job, Ryan's recent move to a bigger apartment, and found, to their mutual surprise, that the conversation didn't feel like grief. It felt, for the first time since the dinner, almost easy again, though easy in a completely different register than before. From there, the relationship rebuilt itself slowly, the way most real things do. They started with occasional texts, then occasional coffee, always careful, always a little formal, in a way that gradually, over the following year, began to soften. Ryan met Grace's college roommate at a birthday party and made her laugh the way an older brother makes a friend laugh, teasing, easy, entirely different from the charged attentiveness that had once defined how he looked at Grace across a room. Grace, for her part, began asking Ryan for advice on things. A car problem, an argument with a coworker, the way a younger sister asks an older brother, trusting his answer not because of romance but because of a kind of steady familiarity that had, somehow, survived the collapse of everything else. Diane watched this slow rebuilding with a complicated mixture of grief and gratitude that she has said she still hasn't fully sorted out, even years later. She had spent 30 years without her daughter. She had gotten her back through the most painful path imaginable, a path that had cost her son an engagement and cost Grace a year of her life she would spend a long time making peace with. But she had gotten her back, invited to birthdays now, present at holidays, slowly folded into the ordinary rhythms of a family that had once, for 3 decades, simply gone on without her. Today, Ryan and Grace are, by every account, close, not as partners, but as siblings in the fullest sense, rebuilding a relationship on terms neither of them ever expected to need, carrying a shared history that very few people will ever fully understand from the outside. They still, occasionally, catch themselves finishing each other's sentences, and they've learned to laugh about it now instead of flinching from what it once meant. Diane, for her part, finally has what she spent 3 decades without, a relationship with the daughter she once held for only 6 hours in an Asheville hospital room, even if it came by way of the most painful path imaginable. She and Grace are still, in Diane's own words, learning each other slowly, the way strangers do, except with the strange, accelerated intimacy of people who already share a face, a laugh, a birthmark. Frank has said less publicly about his own reconciliation with Grace, but those close to the family say the two have grown quietly close over long, unhurried Sunday dinners, the kind of relationship built less on dramatic conversation and more on simple, accumulated time. Carol and Michael Hensley remain, as they always were, unwavering in their love for Grace, though both have said, in later conversations with friends, that the events of that October forced them to reckon with a harder truth about adoption than the hopeful one they had always told at their annual Gotcha Day dinners. That even the most loving family can only ever tell part of a story, and that the missing pieces have a way of finding their way home eventually, whether anyone is ready for them or not. Their story raises a question that few families are ever forced to sit with. If the person you loved most turned out to be family all along, was the feeling itself ever a mistake? Or was it simply love, finding its way back through the one door nobody expected it to walk through, wearing an unfamiliar face because it had never been given the chance to wear a familiar one? Before we let you go tonight, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely love reading through them. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we have another story coming that some of you have been asking about for weeks. One that starts, in its own way, with a very similar kind of coincidence, and ends somewhere none of you will see coming.